Trump is able to force the Iranians into an agreement that will end the Islamic Republic's aggression in the Middle East. I hope that they look at those American warships and agree that now is the time to permanently end the nuclear weapons program, the long-range ballistic missiles, and their support for proxy armies that have brought chaos across the Middle East. But I'm not optimistic that the Iranians are going to do that. In fact, we've seen the very aggressive move of closing the Strait of Hormuz during negotiations with the Americans, publicly rebuffing the idea there can be any deal on ballistic missiles, as Iran suggesting that they're not willing to do that. So the Americans are saying, well, maybe Iran has made a little bit of progress, but they're not even acknowledging America's other red lines. And I think the Israeli perspective is, obviously, we want diplomacy to succeed in ending that threat of Iranian aggression. But the absolute worst outcome would be a return to some form of JCPOA that lifts sanctions on Iran, allows the regime to enrich itself just at the time that it is trying to rebuild that machinery of regional hegemony.
And let's move on to the Board of Peace, if we can. Thanks, Eylon, for answering that question. Why is Israel's involvement in the Board of Peace significant and important at this time?
Well, at the end of the day, the conflict between Hamas and Israel can only be resolved if it ends the threat that Hamas poses to Israeli civilians and people inside Israel. If you want to rebuild Gaza, stocks are going to have to go through Israeli crossings. If you want to build the Gazan economy, it's going to have to be through a connection to the Israeli economy. Israel is very supportive of President Trump's plan. It sees a framework that will deliver the disarmament of Hamas, the demilitarization of Gaza, the deradicalization of the population. And let's remember, those were Israel's goals in the war that Hamas declared on October 7th to begin with. The question now is whether the Trump plan can deliver that. It has laid out a very optimistic vision of what Gaza can look like if it chooses disarmament, demilitarization, and deradicalization. But it says phase 2 is dependent, it's conditional on Hamas fully and immediately disarming. And it's not doing that. In fact, there was a report in the BBC today about how Hamas is taxing merchants in cash in order to reassert control in the Gaza Strip. And it looks like it sees this period simply as a time to regroup for the next confrontation with Israel. So Israel is happy to support the development of the Gaza Strip if the people there choose that they want to live in peace next to Israel. But otherwise, Israel's message is very clear. Hamas Gaza cannot be allowed to rebuild as a base for a terrorist army that wants to invade and take hostages again.
So, Eylon, it's quite interesting because Donald Trump was talking at the Board of Peace earlier, and he said it looks like Hamas will be getting rid of their weapons, but we have to find out. So Donald Trump did really strike an optimistic tone when it came to Hamas demilitarizing, but did caveat that with we have to find out. But with Trump declaring that Gaza is no longer a hotbed of radicalism and terror, what evidence supports that claim, and how might this reshape Iran's policy towards Gaza?
I have not seen any evidence that the Gaza Strip is no longer a hotbed of radicalism.
Well, that's what Trump said, Eylon.
Well, if President Trump has said that, I would be curious to know what that is based on. The fact is that half of the Gaza Strip is still controlled by the Hamas regime that thinks dragging the Middle East into war on October 7th was a good idea. And if we want to have permanent, peaceful reconstruction, the path has to go through de-radicalization. That's point 1 of the Trump peace plan, that there must be de-radicalization. Because otherwise, even if Hamas relinquishes power, we're just going to end up with another government that wants to rebuild Gaza as a launchpad for jihad and war against Israel. And we don't want that. We want to live in peace next to our neighbors in Gaza. And that means there has to be real de-radicalization.
And several close US partners, including the UK, France, Norway and Sweden, have declined to join the Board of Peace, and that's due to questions about neutrality if Israel is a member, while Palestinian representation appears extremely limited. What do you make of this, Eylon?
I think the countries that are declining to join the Board of Peace have questions about the board's broader global role and its efforts to try to circumvent the United Nations. These are countries that are very committed to the existing international institutions and don't want to support an organization that could be seen as a rival. The fact is that with the Board of Peace on the ground, the job of governing Gaza is supposed to be through this National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, which is a board of Palestinian technocrats. That's a government in exile. They're not actually in Gaza right now. I think they're probably quite afraid to go into Gaza because Hamas has made clear it will not relinquish power and it's not giving up their arms. But that is a positive vision. Gaza should be governed by people who want to build it permanently and peacefully, and do not see it as a launchpad for attacks against Israel, do not see it as a temporary staging ground for refugees until they can immigrate into Israel. And I think that's an effort that needs to be supported. But that can only happen if Hamas is disarmed. And that's the elephant in the room that unfortunately no one is addressing. For all the billions of dollars the US wants to pour into Gaza, and the countries that are willing to send soldiers for an international stabilization force, none of that is going to happen if Hamas continues to regroup, rearm, and refuses to relinquish control.
Eylon, just a quick and final thought from you. Do you think that the US partners who don't want to be part of this Board of Peace are concerned about the future two-state solution and Israel's occupation of the West Bank?
Look, Israel's position is that if Israel had withdrawn from the West Bank in the same way it had withdrawn from the Gaza Strip in 2005, we would have seen October 7th coming from the mountains over Tel Aviv on a much larger scale. The October 7 massacre and the celebrations that it elicited within Palestinian society convinced Israelis that the Palestinians do not want to live in peace next to Israel. Their ultimate goal is one Palestinian state from the river to the sea. And the world needs to understand that as long as the Palestinian goal, the Palestinian cause, remains the destruction of the state of Israel, Israelis are not going to make concessions that they view as suicidal, as an existential risk. So if we want to move forward towards peace, we have to get serious about Palestinian radicalization and the root cause of the conflict, which remains the Palestinian refusal to accept a Jewish state within any borders whatsoever. If we can solve that, I'm sure it's possible to move towards a future of peace.
Eylon Levy, always good to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne.